Good morning, everybody, and Borodar to my colleagues at the back. I want to start with lots of things, but I think my first question I want to start with is, do you always trust children's intentions? Just show me a raise of hands. Yeah, do you always trust children's intentions? All right. I appreciate the honesty, and I want you to be thinking about that throughout the morning. Yeah, do we always trust children's intentions? I have made sure you all have a copy of my little schema book because I made a promise to Chris Affey a long time ago that I would do whatever I can to share knowledge of schemas with parents, hence the development of this little schema book. But the quote I want to start off with is this: play is the highest expression of human development in childhood, for it alone is the free expression of what is in the child's soul. I just love that quote. Play is the highest expression of human development in childhood, for it alone is the free expression of what is in the child's soul. And, you know, play is hugely important. And quite often, people say children learn through play, and I'm not disputing that, but what I am saying is that I think play coordinates all learning, and children learn from experience, whether it's McDonald's, whether it's the choo-choo train, or whether it's kind of seeing two churches in blue and red alongside each other. Children learn from experience, and I think we have to really respect children's first-hand experiences. You know, quite often, we've just had Christmas. And prior to Christmas, we do all this stuff around Father Christmas, jingle bells, Christmas decorations. And you know what? When our children come back to us in January, that's when they're wanting to sing Christmas carols. That's when they're wanting to wrap presents. That's when they're wanting to show us all that they know. And we say, do you know what? Our theme is underneath the sea. I think one of the things we do, and we've been doing it for a long time, is we quite often apply a lot of adult logic to children's play. We cannot do that. We must not do that. We have to think about what children know. You know, Froebel talks about starting with what a child can do, building on the known and introducing the unknown. So there'll be things that are familiar to the children, and I'm going to use your wonderful pictures. There'll be things that are familiar to the children. You can build on that rather than introducing something that's completely abstract. I think it's really important that we understand that although play coordinates all learning, and I'm really clear about that, children learn from experience. It's really interesting. I've been working with a setting recently, and one of the things they said they had done in their nursery was they had set up a cafe. But none of the children had been to a cafe, but they'd been to Greg's and McDonald's. So again, you think about it, you build on the known, and then you can introduce the unknown, but don't start with the unknown. I think for me, the other thing about thinking about how children learn and drawing on Tina Bruce's Network for Learning is the notion of struggle. I think struggle is really important to learning. And I think sometimes as educators, we're really uncomfortable with seeing children struggle. But I'm going to say this: if the struggle that we're watching is good struggle, then we carry on observing. If it's bad struggle, and by bad struggle I mean we've asked children to do something that's not appropriate, that's beyond their capabilities. You know, bearing in mind we have seen children as capable. If it's beyond their capabilities, take it away, is what I would say. But if it's good struggle, we need to understand what it will help children to do. I think struggle helps children to solve problems. Struggle helps children to kind of, you know, it increases their own capacity to reach their goal. Struggle teaches children really important lessons like self-discipline, you know, keep on going, don't give up. The process of struggle also enables children to encounter challenges that they can work out for themselves through trial and error. And I think ultimately what struggle does is it teaches children to manage sometimes really difficult emotions. If you carry on doing things for children all the time when you see them struggling, Look at all the learning you are taking away. Play coordinates all learning, and children learn from experience. I think children also learn through exploration and discovery, experimentation and repetition. And I will talk a little bit about schemas. And they also they also need opportunities to practice newly acquired skills. I've for a long time been really passionate about working with parents, and I was really lucky when I was working in the London Borough of Southwark as a consultant. I was seconded to share knowledge of schemas with parents for a whole year, and it was one of the best pieces of research I ever did. I came across a mum who said to me that her son, who was about 18 months, his name was Paul, she told me he had issues. And I was like, okay, what is the issues that he has? She said to me, well, Stella, he doesn't want to play with anything. All he wants to do is open and close things, like opening and closing doors, drawers, showers, glasses, books, whatever he could find, whatever I bought for him, he wouldn't play with it like normal kids. He would just open and close. Now, I was really clear to Mum that I didn't mention the schema word. What I said was that she should encourage his play and also like put his actions into words. So she if he's opening and closing things, she should notice it and say what he's doing. She also said that they were often really late to collect her older child from nursery because Paul would come across gates at people's houses and he would want to open and close them. And he would spend a long time just opening and closing. But he would then get really quite distressed. If they didn't have a gate, he would just stand at the entrance like not knowing what to do. Anyway, as I said, I suggested to Mum to give him the names to kind of back up his actions and encourage him to think about what he's doing. If he was going in drawers and stuff that she didn't want him to go into, she needed to direct the play. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I bump into Mum some 6 months later. And what becomes really interesting is Mum's not telling me that Paul's got issues this time. Mum's saying to me, Paul's a genius. And I just giggled, just like what you did. And I'm like, well, what happened? She said, well, I did exactly what you said. I'd give him the words to back up the actions. And one day he came across an elastic band. And thank you, Elliot, for my prop. He came across an elastic band that had been dropped by the postman outside their front door. He got the elastic band, he attached the elastic band to the kitchen cupboard doors, pulled the doors towards him, and as they slowly closed, he said, look, Mum, I've made an automatic door, just like a bus. Now, my point is this, there's no way we would have known that what he was thinking, but he was exploring. And the question that I asked you at the start, do we always trust children's intentions, is really, really, really important. I don't know your children, you do. Your eyes need to be your tools. You need to understand that whatever your children are doing, they need to do it to help them as part of their learning. That's really, 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 really important. I think what I want to just stop and do before I go on to talk about competence, control and mastery, which I think is what Paul developed, I really do want to talk about schemas. And I want to talk about schemas for lots of different reasons. I think, what do I want to say? I want to say schemas are biological, we're born with them. They're linked to child development and they're always adjusting and changing in light of children's experiences and responses from others. Although basic schemas can be found in every human being in every part of the world in the same way that we have senses, and I don't just mean the 5 senses, I'm talking about all 8 senses, there's absolutely fascinating variations in the way which they are expressed, depending on cultural context and the individual interests, which will emphasize some schemas more than others. But I think the point I want to make here is, as we watch children, we begin to see the different ways that they function. And Jean Piaget talks about I call them sequences because stages almost imply that they're linear and they're not, but sensory and movement is the most important one. So sensory and movement development is important because the child will operate mainly through their senses. So you can see a child that's got the rotation schema and you might see them sort of twirling their hair. You can see that's quite sensory. Or you might see them sort of, you know, doing something like hands going round. But for the symbolic representation, that schema looks quite different. And I think symbolic representation is really, really important. Really important. And what we saw with Kathy's presentation was a whole amount of symbolic representation. What children were doing were representing their lived experiences, their first-hand experiences, but they were doing it via their drawing. And I think when a child uses, you know, but when we go back to the schemas, when children use an object to stand for or represent something that's not there, I think we just think, oh, that's okay. You know, like I can see a child like cooking in a bowl. That's symbolic representation. And actually, the minute a child can do that, that's giving us information about children's thinking. And I think symbolic representation, when we see children representing things symbolically, should be celebrated in the same way we celebrate when they can walk and when they can talk. Cause and effect is where children show an interest in understanding the cause and effect relationship, and the focus is on how things happen and making things happen. So same rotation schema, you know, there was a kid the other day that got the bike, turned the bike upside down. He didn't want to ride the bike. For a little while he kind of stroked the wheels, but then he used the wheels to make the wheels go round. So he has the same rotation schema, but what he's doing is quite different. So it's not just about going out there, oh, that's a schema, there's transporting, there's trajectory, making up your own. You've got to think about children's thinking. Our eyes are our tools. And, you know, I think one of the things I love about Froebel is that he was feisty. He was feisty because one of the things he says is everything our children do, they do for a reason. Your role is to work out what that reason is. The last stage of schema is abstract thought. And, you know, even thinking about your pictures, all of the pictures that you showed, Kathy, your children can talk about it because they've experienced it and they've been able to symbolically represent it. And that's really important. We cannot delete children's experiences. Abstract thought is about, is where children are able to reflect upon and are aware of their own knowledge. I think abstract thought is really, really, really important. But we don't get there unless we've had the other things that go before it, whether it be sensory, whether it be having opportunities to represent our things in a different way. It could be drawing, it could be a dance, it could be a piece of music. I might do some construction. There's not one way to represent. But what we tend to do as educators is only focus on the writing and the reading rather than everything else that kind of surrounds it. But let me go back to Paul. Paul had a level of competence, mastery, and control. He had that because he had opportunities to struggle, to explore, to discover, to experiment and repeat, and to ultimately practice his newly acquired skills in a whole heap of different ways. And I think, you know, where this becomes really important is information can only become knowledge when we've assimilated it and we have an understanding of it and we've internalized it. It's mastered in that way. And I think sometimes we push children because we're just focused on outcomes rather than process. And it's not one versus the other. I think they're both very, 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 very important. Oh dear. Tina Bruce talks about children wallowing in their feelings, in their ideas, and in their relationships. And there's a couple of observations I'm going to share with you. In fact, I'm not going to share a couple, I'm going to share one with you. This is from a practitioner in Monmouth. A little girl in my class would pretend to be a dog. Instead of sitting on my lap, she preferred to curl up on my lap like a dog would. When she was happy and wanted to display affection, she would lick my face and make a loud licking sound to move around the nursery. She wouldn't walk, she would crawl on her hands and knees, and she would bark in response to any questions or adults interacting with her. At snack time, she wouldn't use her hands, she would eat from her bowl like a dog and drink from her cup by lapping up her milk with her tongue like a dog. After visiting the child at home, I learnt that Mum was a dog breeder and she lives with lots of dogs. You know, they were really quite concerned about this little girl. No, I'm being serious. You know, the other feisty thing that Froebel said is if educators are going to use children's play for educational purposes, at least have the audacity to understand what it is that you're seeing. Everything our children do, they do for a reason. Your role is to work out what that reason is. And of that, I'm really quite crystal clear. You know, Tina talks about children wallowing in feelings, in ideas and relationships. And quite often when we observe children, we observe them at like adult-led activities. We don't observe children in the activities that they choose for themselves. I urge you to observe children in the activities that they choose for themselves, because when you do, you see their ideas, you see their experiences emerge from their play. And I think sometimes we give very little value to that kind of play and much more value to our outcome-based activities. And I think as educators, if you are working with children, if you are in the classroom, if you are in the setting, you need to know what your children are exploring with. I remember there was a little boy I worked with called Tonton, and his mum had a baby. And shortly after his mum had a baby, he would play a particular game. And again, it was about representation. He would get 2 blocks. One was the bin, and one was the recycling bin. And then he'd get 4 figures, which represented him, his mum, his dad, and the baby. And I guarantee you, at the end of the play, the baby was in the recycling bin. Listen, children use their play to help them make sense of the world. And children learn from experience. If we want to give children new experiences, we need to actually give them the experience. And I think when we're watching children, we will see that children will imitate. We'll also see that children will pretend, but they'll pretend in a literal way. And I call this kind of play pretend play 1. So quite often when you're watching some children, you'll see them on the telephone, but they've got to have a real phone. They cannot take this and pretend it's a phone. This is not a phone. This is whatever it is. This is a phone. And I think sometimes we expect children to share. And actually, it really isn't about sharing. It's about making sure we've got real everyday items in our settings and in our classrooms so they can show us what it is they know and what it is they can do. And as I said, pretend play 2 is where children will make one object, a word, a gesture, a sound, a mark stand for another. And as I say, it's a huge milestone in development. And when children can think in a symbolic way, they're no longer tied to here and now. They can anticipate the future. You know, they're imaginative. They're thinking much more imaginatively. I also talk about fantasy F play. And I think fantasy F play is where children will play out roles that they may be. They might be a fireman, they might be a policeman riding round arresting people for speeding, they might be a doctor, a baker, a teacher, a mummy, a daddy. They may or may not be those things in real life, but their play enables them to play out of those roles, of the things that they see. Like your child, you know, with the McDonald's. They've been to McDonald's, so they can pretend. And then there's another type of play that I call fantasy PH. And fantasy PH is when they're being a dog, a dinosaur, a rat, a cat. And as Kathy said, it could be that they desire a rat, and that's why they're playing out that game. Or it could be that they're really interested in Spider-Man, Superman, whoever the superhero may be. It really doesn't matter. But I think we've got to become much more respectful of children's play. And I think there's something else I want to pick up on. I remember many years ago, I worked with a little girl called Emily, who, Emily was always dressed up with stuff. She always had like clothes on, like hats, dressing gowns, necklaces. She was always doing things. She would take all the books off the bookshelf and she'd put them on the floor. She wouldn't be reading them, but then she'd get her dressing gown and she'd cover her dressing gown with these books. Emily was a little bit of my nightmare, if I'm honest, because she was always making a mess. And I remember once I kind of went to a jumble sale and I bought lots of things, and I said to Emily, look, the stuff in the home, in fact I said my stuff in the home corner stays in the home corner, but you can move whatever you want to in this suitcase. But I remember one day Emily made a drawing, and she would rarely draw. She made a drawing and then she completely covered it. And my colleague Geraldine that I was working with was like, oh, she's made a mistake. I was going to put it up. And I asked Emily what her drawing was of. And she said to me, it's me and my mum underneath the duvet. Now you think about it. If you and your mum are underneath the duvet, you can't be seen. And I think what we sometimes do is we ask children the wrong questions. We apply adult logic to their play. And again, I don't think we should do that. Now, this is really important to me, metacognition. So many people have said to me, Stella, this is such an old-fashioned word. It might be an old-fashioned word, but I really like it. I really, really like it because this is how children are developing an awareness of their own thinking and doing. And I think being able to develop an awareness of your own thinking and doing is really, 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 really important. Because under metacognition comes things like self-review. And I think helping children to reflect was of immense importance to Froebel. He argued that this was the most weightiest part of education. So things like metacognition and self-review are really, really, really important because it's about children knowing what they know. And I think being able to draw, being able to sing, being able to write, have stories read about things that you do will help the disembedded thinking. When we come to storying, I think what becomes really important about storying, I remember being on a flight. I'd gone to South Africa. I was feeling quite menopausal, grumpy. I was working on my own. 13-hour flight. As I approach my seat, I see a 4-year-old, and I think, oh God, no. I'm being serious. I didn't want to, I just wanted to sleep. Anyway, I sat down next to this little 4-year-old. I was by the window, she was in the middle. Her dad was next to her. We had the aisle, and then her mum was there with her 2 brothers. I sat down and I said I was Stella. She said she was Bella, had a bit of a giggle. She didn't shut up. She told me all her business. She told me why she was in South Africa. She told me that her mum's dad had had a stroke and that's why they were there. Her sister was in Somerset with her other grandmother, her dad's dad, her dad's mum. She told me how naughty her 2 brothers had been, all the things that they had done. And like, it was really lovely. She spoke to me a lot. At the end of the flight, I got up and I said goodbye. And she said to me, oh, thank you for being nice to me. I felt like a cow. Because it wasn't that I was nice. I know I was trapped in my seat, but I did listen. And I think that's my point. I think sometimes we don't talk to children about what they know, and we don't listen to them. We have our own preconceived agenda. You know, if a child's saying that they want to draw about fighting, we're like, oh, no, don't do that. Oh, come on. Do we always trust children's intentions? And I'm not going to spend, I'm going to talk a little bit about games because I think games are really, really, really important. I think when we're watching children play, we will see them play lots of games, and I think games help children do many, many different things. They help children learn how rules are made, how to keep them, how to negotiate somebody else's rules, how to be part of a culture. Games are of huge importance. I'm not going to spend much time now talking about representation because I think your representations were wonderful. And representations aren't just drawings, they're dances, they're music, they're songs, they're constructions, they're dough, they're woodwork, they're clay. Children's representations, as Kathy's presentation really did point out, are based on their own real first-hand experiences. You can teach children whatever it is you want to teach them, but you must make sure their representations are based on their own experiences. A little while ago, I was in Sheffield with Fufi, and it was at the start of the year, And in this nursery that we were at, there were some beautiful representations of daffodils. And what was really, really quite special was that you could tell they were daffodils because of the colours that they were used, but some of them didn't look like daffodils, but they were their own representations. And I hate going into rooms where it's all the same. We've got Mother's Day. How many of you have spent time making sure that children got Mother's Day cards to give their mothers? And I bet they're all the same. I mean, come on, it's just not on. Representations must be based on their own real experiences. And the idea of Mother's Day is actually quite abstract. I want to talk about play. I think there are 5 main, in fact I don't think there are 5 main types of play. I now think there are 7, but for this presentation I'm going to talk about 5 main types of play. I think there's physical play, which is hugely important. Movement is absolutely critical to learning. The whole child is active, moving, feeling, thinking, and willing. But there's also play with objects. And I was really surprised. I was training the other day. I was really surprised, and I was talking about, you know, treasure baskets when a child is able to sit up on their own, heuristic play. And there were practitioners that knew nothing about what I was talking about. It's through a child's own actions that they begin to understand the world. And I think what's wonderful about treasure baskets is that children are exploring real, everyday objects. And then by the time they've kind of moved on to heuristic play, you see them kind of imitating and beginning to pretend and showing you what it is they know and what it is they can do. And when I think about symbolic play, it's language, it's visual, it's music, it's communication, it's literacy skills, it's so much more. And I think we've got to think about children's holistic development rather than just focusing on our outcomes. You know, pretend play is important. Again, it's about those narrative skills. And again, we saw from Kathy's presentation that, you know, children will want to kind of draw and act out and play out what they do. And games with rules is a type of play. But I think the other play I would put on this now is creative play, or creativity, and I would put imitative play. Obviously a piece of work in progress, which I am developing. You know, Tina Bruce talks about the features of play, and you can already begin to see some correlations. First-hand experiences, making up rules, symbolically represents, making props. What's really important is it's really easy for educators to say, you go over there and play, and you 3 go outside. Yeah, you're going to see play, but you're going to see really, really superficial play. I think children playing alone is really, really important, and we need to give children opportunities to play alone, because if I go back to what Froebel says, children need time to reflect, to think about what they're doing. And sometimes when you're playing alone, you can do that level of consolidation, which I think is important. Just continuing the features of play. But you can see how the features of play link with the network of learning. The features of play also link with the 5/7 types of play. I think my key messages for today are these. We need to understand that children learn through their own efforts. They don't learn just because we are teaching them. They do learn through their own efforts. And actually it's the activity, the doing, that leads to thinking, reasoning and understanding. And I think, you know, Froebel was really good at providing children with worthwhile learning opportunities to help their thinking. He was really good at thinking about children's development, watching and knowing what went before, and really sort of supporting whatever stage it was children were at. I think children need to be able to go outside and play free of apparatus. They need to run, they need to climb, they need that freedom. And I think outdoor areas that are just natural, are just wonderful, really wonderful for children. Please don't underestimate the importance of real first-hand experiences. You know, whatever you want to teach children, you can be as ambitious as you want. I applaud you. Build on what's known. Because if you build on what's known, whatever you give them, the foundation is firm. However, if you're building on something that's unfamiliar, you're wasting your time and theirs. You know, don't underestimate how important a rich learning environment is in supporting children's free choice and their autonomy. You know, I remember when I was a young student, I remember Tina Bruce saying to me, Stella, how you structure your learning environment, you dictate the quality of learning that's going to take place. And I'm going to say the same to all of you. How you structure your learning environment, you dictate the quality of learning that's going to take place. And I think we also need to make sure that we give children time to struggle, time to explore, time to discover, and time to be able to apply what they know in meaningful ways. So the known becomes better known. That's really, really, really important. You know, how children learn hasn't changed in 40 years. I'll tell you what has changed is the what children learn. And my best piece of advice, if you just focus on the what, every time there's a new curriculum, you're throwing your baby out with your bathwater. However, if you focus on the how children learn, regardless of the curriculum, it could be in New Zealand, it could be in South Africa, it could be in Malta, it could even be in St. Lucia. You have knowledge of that child. And I think, you know, what I said earlier on about children wallowing in their feelings, in their ideas and in their relationships. Froebel talks about the inner life of the child and its outer expression. Children will express themselves in lots of different ways, and whatever they do for a reason. And don't get me wrong, sometimes it's really frustrating when you don't know what that reason is. But if you trust children's intentions, you will find a way to understand what that reason is. You know, child development is really, really important. I've become quite disheartened, if I'm honest. And I feel really sad. I've become really, really disheartened. Like, I don't understand how you can work with children if you don't understand child development. I don't understand. No, but I don't. How can you work with children if you don't understand their development? I wouldn't go to a doctor that didn't know what he was doing, and I wouldn't go to a dentist. Yet we're putting our most precious children with practitioners that it's not their fault, don't know what they're doing because they're not being equipped. They're not being given the skills that they need. Listen, we need to find this is a real plight. We need to find real meaningful ways that practitioners understand the different stages of development that children go through and they support it. You know, we wouldn't force the stages of the moon. Why are we forcing the stages of child development? I often say, you know, there's a wonderful principle that talks about childhood is not about preparation for life. It's a stage within its own right. Childhood is now. If your children need to climb today, you give them things to climb today. I don't think it can wait till next week, next month, or tomorrow. Childhood is now. Childhood is not preparation for the next stage. Childhood is a stage within its own right, and I think we need to be much more respectful. We need to understand each stage depends on what's gone before, and each stage needs to be lived. We don't want to kind of think about the hurried child. And I think ultimately, whatever we do for our children, we need to make that learning meaningful. Because, you know, you can see from the pictures or the drawings that Kathy shared with us how meaningful that learning was. And really, you know, childhood, Peter Dixon says, childhood is the springtime of life. And I really loved that because in the spring, even though we're going to lose an hour's sleep tonight, in the spring, it's the nicest season and it's the time that you see the most growth. You know, researchers are indicating that at least 85% of the brain has been developed by the time the child is 3. Listen, children are our future. You know, the richer the experiences we give our children, the richer those children will be. And, you know, I just wanted to kind of just make a reference to the 2 women that talked about their children and their schemas. I just want to say this. You feed a child schema. You have the ability to lead that child to its destiny, whatever his or her destiny may be. And what you find is that you have completely contented children rather than children that are just existing. I think the role of the adult is important. We need to work with parents, we need to be observers, we need to interact, we need to sometimes play alongside, sometimes we need to support, and sometimes we need to extend. But I'm cautious. We don't just run to extend something because we want an outcome. We need to make sure that what's known is really known. So sometimes support and opportunities to practice newly acquired skills is needed. I think I've always, as I said, been really passionate about working with parents. Got to see parents as our partners. You know, we have a pedagogical responsibility to share knowledge of how children learn with their parents. Parents have a good knowledge of their children, but you know, we should have a good knowledge of child development and how children learn. Got to see our parents as a bridge. And I think we need to respect children's first-hand experiences, whatever they may be. 5 years on since COVID, quite often I'm being told about what children can't do. Be a Froebelian and focus on what they can do. If there are experiences they don't have, give it to them. And make sure you look for children's best intentions. Thank you.